Do you think we should begin? I see
Yes,
that
we have.
Yeah.
I think we can begin. Yeah.
I think we're now at 168 people, so I think we should start. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Drayson. I'm the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which is, of course, the regional planning agency for the 101 cities and towns in Greater Boston. I want to welcome you here this morning to this webinar on the REMAP program, Racial Equity Municipal Action Plan program. Sometimes we can't exactly decide whether the P stands for plan or program, but we'll work that out in the course of our efforts. Over the course of the last several months, our society has gone through so many strains and struggles, starting with COVID and then moving on to the death of George Floyd, as a reminder of the death of many other people who have suffered at the hands of violence on the part of law enforcement. And the demonstrations that have followed, indicating such a deep and resonant desire for healing and for change in our region and in our country. Beginning well before either of those things, our three organizations came together to try and plan this program based upon our longstanding and common commitment to racial equity, and particularly to limiting or eliminating the racial wealth divide, which is so profound in the Greater Boston area. And I would like to introduce the members of our team. We are a three-organization effort from the Boston Fed, Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, which covers, I believe, all of New England. We have, if I could shift very briefly to their title so that I will introduce everybody correctly, Prabal Chakrabarty, who will be speaking to you shortly, who's Executive Vice President and Community Affairs Officer at the Fed. Anna Steiger, Vice President in the Department of Administrative Officer, Regional and Community Outreach. Desiree Allen, Director of Strategy, who has more recently come to the Fed. We're so glad to have Desiree with us. Maria Bingulak, Senior Community Development Analyst, Regional and Community Outreach. We are also very pleased today to be joined by our third partner organization, GARE, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, by their director, Gordon Goodwin, who is actually going to make a fairly substantial presentation to you shortly. On my team from MAPC, I would like to introduce Raul Gonzalez, who has principal responsibility for this program and who is a senior regional planner in our Economic Development Division. Nicole Sanchez from our Clean Energy Division, who is also with Raul, the co-chair of our racial equity team at MAPC and has been playing a critical role in this effort. Marjorie Weinberger, our chief counsel, and Sasha Parodi, our event planner and community engagement specialist, who will be working with Nicole to manage the Zoom effort today. All three of our organizations have come to recognize that there's a tremendous hunger among local governments to try and address the issue of racial equity. We hope and pray in a more straightforward, honest, deliberative, and forceful way than they ever have in the past. And the need for this could never be greater. So we have designed this program with two particular parts in mind. The first, a 4-month training session where people will engage largely under the auspices of GARE because of their tremendous nationwide experience in this arena, in a period of 4 months of training, reflection, and self-assessment. And then an 8-month period that is focused on developing a regional equity municipal action plan with actionable steps, both short-term and long-term, based on efforts throughout the community within municipal government and external to municipal government to try and address in an open and straightforward manner steps that can be taken to practically reduce the racial wealth divide, address some of the issues that we've seen with law enforcement, and also address other issues in specific communities. We expect to have 3 to 5 participants in this program. I wish we could select more, but we are going to use this year as a test case, and already we are beginning to try and raise funds not only for this year, but for next year as well, so that hopefully we will be able to enroll even more communities in this process. each and every community faces different circumstances, and each and every community will develop a different plan. But they all face elements of institutional and systemic racism that are common throughout the country. And so I believe it's important, while we recognize differences, to also recognize that we're also common brothers and sisters in this cause and in this effort, and that many of the historic challenges we face are remarkably similar to one another. So we will not only be working in individual communities, but we will be trying to encourage sharing among the members of the cohort, the 3 to 5 participating municipalities, other communities in the MAPC region and throughout Massachusetts, and also throughout the GARE network, which expands from coast to coast. I think there's so much that we can learn from each other. The 3 organizations that you see before you today approach this with a certain degree of humility. We understand that we don't have the answers. There are some times that we don't even have the exactly right questions. But with the folks who apply and are selected to participate in this effort, I hope that we will explore both those questions and those answers and try and develop a fairer and more just path forward for ourselves, and even more importantly, for our children. I'm going to just mention a few practical items. The application, which is a relatively simple and straightforward application. We did not want the app to become a burden to applying. The application is due on the 20th of August. It is due at 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. It is a 2 to 3 page project concept, which you will submit by email to Raul Gonzalez at rgonzalez@mapc.org. And all of that information is available in the notice of grant opportunity and also in the application form. And Raul will be mentioning it at the end of this event. Lastly, I would note before moving on that we decided, because of the tremendous interest, to make this a 90-minute session instead of 60 minutes. If we can finish early, that's great. We know everyone's busy, but we also know there may be many questions, and we want to have an opportunity to answer those questions to the best of our ability and to clarify things for all the different applicants. So we will be with you as needed until 10:30 this morning. I'm now going to turn it over to Prabal Chakrabarty, a good and long friend of mine at the Boston Fed, who's going to speak for the Fed about their engagement. Prabal.
Thank you, Mark, and it's so wonderful to have so many of you. What a great response, and what an exciting morning for us. I'm so pleased on behalf of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston to be launching this effort together with our partners. This is the result, as Mark alluded, of a lot of hard work to get here, and it's just the first step in what we expect will be a very productive journey. So let me just say, some of you may be wondering, why is the Federal Reserve involved in an effort around this? And I think increasingly, some of you may not be wondering that, because you know of some of the actions and steps that we have been taking more recently as both a Boston Fed and as a Fed system. But just as a quick sort of reminder about the goal of the Fed, you know, we have a dual mandate around stable prices, yes, inflation and interest rates, but also around full employment. And we very much see our engagement in this effort as related directly to our full employment mandate. Now that's kind of technical, kind of bureaucratic. I think the Atlanta Fed President, Raphael Bostic, put it even better in a recent essay that he wrote that you should absolutely read if you have the chance. He called addressing racial equity a moral and economic imperative, that without doing so, we would constrain our economy's potential. And I think that's a different, better way, I think, of describing our dual mandate and our participation in this effort. Now, the Boston Fed has a long history of addressing racial issues. In fact, in the early 1990s, the Boston Fed Research Department conducted a landmark study of racial discrimination that changed the way in which lending is done in this country, and changed policy around the Community Investment Act and other important legislation. So we have a history of doing this. More recently, many of you know the Boston Fed for the Color of Wealth study, which pointed to the very steep racial wealth divide that we find in metropolitan Boston. And so this is very important to us, addressing the racial wealth divide. Following that study, a work group came together across different organizations. Some of you may have participated in that. And this effort really arises out of some of the discussion and dialogue that group had about solutions and, or at least responses to address that racial wealth divide. They talked about different areas of work, not simply what we're announcing today, but things that are more broadly about narrative change, about analyzing policy and strengthening the capacity of organizations. And I think this effort incorporates all three of those elements. So what I really want to talk about is why we believe this effort is going to result in, and you can hear more about it, but why do we think it's going to result in those kinds of economic outcomes that are part of our dual mandate? So I think first and foremost, it thinks about focusing on racial equity. It takes as an assumption that business as usual is not going to make the sufficient kind of change, that we really need systemic change. And so there it focuses on reducing the racial wealth divide and related economic disparities using, by changing systems. So this isn't going to be about a single program or a specific initiative. It's going to be more broadly about changing the system. One piece of that is training around race and equity at the municipal level. We think that's crucial to promoting an equitable recovery. We really see municipalities, cities, as an important driver of policies that can impact the racial wealth divide. And we know that by some of the tangible economic results that those cities that have taken on some specific activities have done. I want to note some of these kinds of activities can include, this isn't a prescriptive list, this is simply a list of examples. Asset building for minority entrepreneurs. The city of Seattle was able to more than triple an increase in purchasing dollars for minority and women-owned businesses. We know similar increases have occurred in cities like Memphis that have taken this on. Another example is increasing employment opportunities. We know that cities and municipalities control some of these levers and are able to, either as employers or in terms of what they're investing in, improve the outcomes in employment outcomes. We also know reforms in fines and fees. This really came to the fore during the Ferguson, Missouri protests and the murder that occurred there. So what we have is a situation in which there's been a lot of action taken by municipalities that have resulted in tangible outcomes, but these have been in different pieces. What we think has been put together has really drawn upon the expert knowledge of our partners, the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission and the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, GARE and MAPC. And so we're so pleased to be launching this effort with our partners, with their expertise and what they've learned in their work, both across the Boston region and Massachusetts, but also across the country. And so you really have some excellent and incredible technical assistance providers to help you put together some really, I think, terrific proposals and efforts. I think the last thing I'll say is this is the result of the work of our partners, who I thank, but also Maria Bingulak, who's really been the spearhead of putting this effort together. So I want to thank her. I also want to thank Sol Carbonell, who had a lot to do with getting this effort onto this stage and the platform that it is. So I know we don't have long. I'm going to stop there, but just give our hearty endorsement of enthusiasm and involvement as an active partner as a Boston Fed in this effort. Thank you.
Prabal, thank you so much. I know you have to leave for some other meetings fairly soon, but the other representatives of the Fed are going to be with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over briefly to Sasha Perotti, who's going to provide some basic ground rules for our Zoom this morning.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everyone. As you can see, you are all muted. This event is also being recorded, so the recording will be available to you afterwards. We are taking questions today, as Mark mentioned, and if you scroll to the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be a Q&A button that you can click on. I see a few of you have already made use of it, which is great. Please feel free to send any questions via that chat function, that Q&A chat function. If you are calling in, please email your questions to rgonzalez@mapc.org. And that email should also be in the reminder that we sent to you all yesterday. Additionally, just a note that we may not be able to get to all of the questions today, but please know that all of your questions are saved, and if we can't respond to them immediately, we will do our best to respond to them afterwards. And thank you everyone so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sasha. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to a presentation by Gordon Goodwin, Director from Government Alliance on Racial Equity. GARE is a national leader in this field. We are tremendously blessed to have them with us in this endeavor. Gordon's going to talk a little bit about their general program and how it applies, and also a little bit more about the specifics of REMAP. Take it away, Gordon.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Mark. It's great to be here with all of you. My name is Gordon Goodwin, and I'm speaking to you from St. Paul, Minnesota, which is where I'm based, but the GARE program is national, as Mark mentioned. We are a part of an organization called Race Forward. And Race Forward is one of the nation's largest racial equity organizations. It has offices in New York, where we're headquartered, but also in Oakland. The GARE staff is located throughout the country. Race Forward is about catalyzing the movement for building racial justice. And key to our work in building a movement for racial justice is the role of institutions. So the GARE program, Government Alliance on Racial Equity, is part of a department that is really focused on institutional and sectoral change. The Government Alliance on Race and Equity actually started back in about 2012 and really began to develop a membership about 2014 with about 12 jurisdictions across the country who were coming together in solidarity to really begin to advance the, racial equity within their working environments, but also for the people that they're directly accountable to at the community level. Since that time, we've grown to over 200 members. The membership now spans nearly all of the 50 states. We have state departments that are members, park systems, library systems, and a significant amount of county and municipal governments that are involved. What GARE is about taking the theory of how we begin to address racial equity and to begin to put that into practice. So really beginning to operationalize and going beyond conversations about race to really begin to understand how can we begin to make real change that has a difference in people's lives. My objectives for today with us are to just tell you about some of the grounding assumptions for the GARE approach. What is a racial equity learning community? What is this opportunity generally about, and our approach to working with jurisdictions in this work? What you're going to be learning about, and what is the time frame and the commitment. So just in terms of why we do the work that we do focused on race, everything that we're going through right now with COVID-19 recovery, with how we're taking a fresh look at criminal justice systems and structures and trying to think about what the public safety aspect of that needs to be, how we are actually thinking about our society and how we are going to have functioning institutions in a democracy that is racially diverse, ethnically diverse, and one that is rapidly changing in terms of its demography, is all about why race matters in our society today. We know that when we take a look at key measures of success in American life, that we can predict how well you will do based upon your race. Your race, the zip code you're born into, your gender, all of these factors borne out by social determinants of health are some of the things that help us understand when we start taking a look around our communities and seeing that in terms of COVID deaths, people of color, and in particular African-American people, are dying at twice the rate, having contraction at twice the rate that we're seeing now in our Latinx communities, significant uptick in COVID. When we take a look at our Native communities, now they are starting to also suffer significantly from the disease. We have to acknowledge that the pre-existing conditions for that are not all about what our genealogy is about. It's about the fact that for decades, governments enforced laws that really created the racial inequities we're living with today. And it's about the fact that the compounded generational disadvantage that's occurred as a result of that has people living in circumstances and in professions where they're more likely to be exposed, less likely to have insurance, less likely to have the household wealth and income that's needed so that you can socially distance, get the care that you need, and actually be able to isolate yourself so that you're not going to be sick. So we've just gone through a tremendous demonstration of how systemic and structural factors really contribute to how healthy we're going to be. It's often hard to think about how when we say racism, that we're not talking about intent with that word. We're not just talking about individual acts of bigotry here. As harmful and as hateful as those might be, and the fact that we are called to say something when those things happen, to acknowledge that they happened, and we want people to know that we know the difference between what's wrong and what's right. When we spend a lot of time in that area, at the expense of taking a look at some of the practices and the procedures and the policies that we use every day in government, an institution that's supposed to be there for all of us through good times and bad, if we don't start taking a look at those processes and procedures and begin to understand how they may be unintentionally, but actually contributing to racialized outcomes in our society, then we're not doing everything we need to do. Yes?
I'm sorry, but is your presentation supposed to be on at this moment? Because we're not seeing it currently. Apologies for that.
It is, and
you don't mind just sharing your screen? So you were very eloquent in describing what the presentation was all about. So there's no need to go back because it was pretty thorough. I like that.
Thank you. I thought that it was on screen. Is it on screen now?
It sure is.
Very good. And thank you for letting me know. All right. As I was saying, if we're not taking a look at the practices and the procedures that we use every day that get us the efficiencies that we need, that often are absolutely race agnostic, but still contribute to racialized outcomes, we're not doing what we were called to do as stewards of the public trust and stewards of the public purse. So we have a responsibility when we work for government to actually begin to understand how some of what we do every day is contributing to racialized outcomes. And what that means is we have to start thinking about structural and institutional as where we're spending the focus of a lot of our time. The other piece is this, is that while we ask that government be very explicit in naming race as one of the key factors, the key factor, that is an opportunity for breakthrough, an opportunity for redefining how we talk about excellence and service to our communities. It's no longer possible for us to say, if we're reaching 80% of the people or 75% of the people, that that's okay. when we're missing out on significant numbers of people of color in our society. But we realize race is not the only factor. It's not the only factor that has determined how people's outcomes and how their lives are being determined. So we're asking you to be race explicit, but it's not race exclusive. There's always an intersectional analysis, and it is always the case that when we apply race to that intersectional analysis, we find that race becomes one of those weighting factors. And all I have to ask you to think about is the differences between women's pay and men's pay, and breaking that down by race. And we see that in general, white women, although they may not be earning the same amounts as white men, I think anywhere from 88 to 99 cents, depending upon the profession. When we start breaking it down by race, women of color come in lower than that. African-American women, sometimes it's 77 cents on the dollar, depending upon what your market is. Latinx women, lower than that, and Native women, lower than that. So why a learning community? Why do we do this as a learning community? Why do we call it a learning community? A couple of key things here about doing this work. Operationalizing racial equity, it's a developing field. When people come to us and they ask us for the top 10 list of things to do within HR or within public works, one of the things we're quick to let them know is that if they are not doing their own analysis, then what we share with them is not necessarily going to work for them, because there are differences that occur in government based upon the practices that you're using. You have to get involved in doing the work. Doing the work requires you to apply some data analysis. We're going to be grounding this in some data analysis, and we're going to be grounding it in data that we can disaggregate by race. And that's key. So this is a developing field. The standards of practice have not all been defined yet. Part of what you will be participating in is helping to define those standards of practice. And the way that we begin to do that is to apply those concepts and skills to real situations that you are facing in your jurisdictions. You will actually bring some of the challenges that we'll be focusing on together. The peer exchange amongst the jurisdictions that are participating here. And that means talking about how we're using these tools, what we're learning from the process, the good, the things that are successful and the things that are not successful are going to be key for how we all make progress here. And I can guarantee you that because this is a change to your approach and is going to require coordination across departments and perhaps sometimes across jurisdictions for some of the larger issues that you are trying to address, perhaps like housing, that's going to require you to change what you do at the organizational level. And change is always difficult. That's actually part of the challenge of doing the work. We are ultimately not just trying to change some of the structures and systems of our processes within government, but actually do that in such a way that it's having an impact on people's lives, some measurable impact on improving people's lives. And that's ultimately what we're trying to achieve. What that means, of course, is that we have to have the participation of those who are most significantly impacted by racial inequities in our communities in doing this work. The other aspect of why we have this cohort approach is to focus on local challenges and solutions. You are bringing some of the long-term issues to the table, along with REMAP, which has significant regional influence. So you will have a really good understanding about what are some of the things that are priorities, both within your jurisdiction and across jurisdictions. We're going to be building on existing programs and practices. We've got to do that. We do not bring to you a set of programs and practices transplanted from elsewhere. What we do bring is the knowledge of how tools were used to get to new solutions that you can make your own. And we welcome you to make those tools your own and to adopt them into your regular way of doing business, because we know when that happens, that the change will be sustainable long-term. This is about supporting the adoption of promising practice. We were having a discussion yesterday about best practice, which suggests that it's been tested and tried many, many times before, and you can pretty much document almost like a recipe. You do these things, you get this particular outcome or result. The promising practices are those that are working in terms of how the tools are being used. But it's really getting down to how we are refining those tools and how we're measuring what type of result they're having at the community level. Are people better off? This is also an opportunity for you to learn alongside other communities in the region, as well as with them. And what that means is that we're going to be asking for new levels of transparency and willingness to share, willingness to be vulnerable in terms of what you're trying. We're not always going to have the right answers. It's more important to actually start sharing how we are getting to some shared sense of understanding about what we need to change. You're also going to have the opportunity to share this work with a national network of jurisdictions and leaders who are trying to move this field forward and are making some real breakthroughs. So that's also one of the reasons that we enjoy doing this work with cohorts of jurisdictions. What are we learning about actually? Well, this is drawn from organizational change research, but it's also drawn from the work of jurisdictions who have been doing the work of racial equity over the past couple of decades, actually, starting in Seattle and then also from other jurisdictions. What's a key to our approach is normalizing the discussion about race within governments for the purposes of having people understand that although in many governmental environments, with the exceptions of some professions like planning and criminal justice, race is generally not talked about. It's something that's avoided. And it's avoided in many ways because people are raised with maybe the ethic of, we don't see race, talking about race, being race explicit in the governmental environment, maybe brushing up against some of the things we're not supposed to do, and we're very uncomfortable with it. But if we are not able to understand and take a look at our data and begin to see that there are disproportionalities in terms of who's overrepresented in poverty, homelessness, lack of access to employment, lack of access to education, transportation, some of the key things that we provide, and not begin to ask the question, why is this happening? Why is it that there are people who are falling in the gaps? Are there barriers to participation that we're not aware of? If we're not able to begin to have that discussion in the context of race, when our data shows us very clearly that that is certainly part of the challenge, then we're avoiding some of the real issues associated with that. And this is going to be about acknowledging the history of government and race, how that has led to our present situation, but then also how race and systems and structures are related, and some of the challenges are related. Very important to understand that. A lot of what's happening might be unintentional, but it's happening nonetheless, and that means it's having a significant impact on people's lives. So that shared analysis, definitions and terms and concepts that we can begin to have a broader discussion about with all of our staff That's going to start with the level of your core teams. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but that needs to become part of the culture change, more importantly, that is going to be absolutely necessary to drive this work. The organizing aspect of this is around your core team and how that core team actually grows. This will be sort of a rapid growth effort to move that core team forward and get it up to speed. But some of the thinking that's done around how does this work begin to build and influence change within our organizational structure is going to have to come down to thinking about a racial equity action plan and how we begin to identify opportunities to test bed use of the racial equity tool that begins to, over time, in this process, engage more people in doing the work and demonstrating how it can actually have benefit within a reasonably measurable amount of time. So again, going beyond discussions, but getting to the point of, so what are we actually doing differently? And how are we creating an infrastructure for change that can help us move this work forward beyond this demonstration period? So that internal infrastructure, change teams, think about this as change teams, is going to be important. And the partnerships across departments, but also at the community level, are going to be crucial to giving us insights about what are some of the things that we're not seeing as the impacts in our work. Operationalizing is about the use of the racial equity tools, and it's also going to be about communication. Communication is a key carrying capacity for all of this, but also how we use data and mapping to better understand what the challenges are. And visualizing, which is not just a job for elected officials, but for all of us. How do we begin to reimagine some of the services that we're providing as actually reaching everyone in our community? Can we have a vision for what a racially equitable jurisdiction looks like, and who's participating in government, and who's within government? How our economy reflects the full racial and ethnic diversity of everyone living in our community. That is also a key piece, not only for us, but for the public that we serve. Here's a general map, roadmap of where we're going next. So the circular is out about this opportunity. It's our intention to have municipalities selected by September the 10th. And then phase one of an orientation to this work and a grounding in the work begins in October. And there is one mistake on this slide, goes to February of 2021. So I'll make that correction to the slide, apologies. But that will be the initial period of grounding the core teams to this work. So municipal core teams are going to be formed. You'll be getting some advice about that, but also having some time to do that in this part of the process. We'll be learning about the role of government in racial equity, and you'll be taking a look at your own history as a jurisdiction to get a clear understanding about your own jurisdiction's racial history. We'll also be spending some time developing a racial equity narrative about why we are doing this work, which is going to be crucial for how we communicate about it internally, but is also helpful for our elected officials who are most accountable to the public and who often need to have really important messaging for why we're doing this work. Creating the infrastructure for change is about what it is that we're going to need to do on the pathway towards developing the racial equity action plans so that we can be successful implementing it. And it's beyond the core team, but also thinking about who are some of our data partners for this work, and how we begin to just get ready to move it forward at a larger scale. We'll be looking at using data and racial equity tools, start identifying some prospects for racial equity analysis, some pilot projects, and begin having some discussions about local and regional equity focus areas. So it's hoped that maybe one of the benefits of this work is how a set of jurisdictions might work together on an issue like housing or transportation. Phase 2, getting into more of the developing the Racial Equity Action Plan. There is more significant emphasis on community participation and involvement to inform the Racial Equity Action Plans and the toolkit process. Those toolkit projects should be underway at this point and beginning to yield some understanding about what needs to be changed. And then the municipalities are going to create their racial equity action plans during this period of time and begin to have departments move some of their information forward for those racial equity plans. There'll also be a fair amount of peer exchange that's taking place during this time, as well as technical assistance and coaching. Broadly, in terms of the commitment, although the circular goes into more detail on this, we're asking jurisdictions to form teams of up to 12 participants. That can represent the depth and breadth of your municipal team in terms of having representatives from the senior leadership team, from middle management, so supervisors and managers and line staff, and also elected and community leaders can also be participating in the effort. We do ask you to really think about in terms of the time that is going to be committed for this process, to think about your teams in terms of being predominantly municipal participants, so elected officials and staff. Phase 1 will require monthly attendance at REMAP online capacity building sessions, so some of the trainings. 75 hours are anticipated for phase 1. That includes both training sessions and work in your municipal core teams. Phase 2 is really getting into the practicum stage, if you will, where you're going to be working what you've used, what you've learned in phase 1. There will still be some training sessions that will continue, if only to revisit some of those topics, so to make sure that everybody's applying it correctly, but a lot more in the area of peer-based exchange during that segment, and time for your municipal team to move its work forward. And of course, the commitment to share what you're learning with the REMAP cohort and the GARE network. And that could take the form of maybe participating in some webinars with MAPC, or perhaps thinking about other ways that your work is being shared with the Boston Fed or through GARE. So now I think we've come to the point of time where I'm going to ask if there are any clarifying points from either Mark or the Boston Fed team on anything I've presented, and we can begin to go to the questions phase. I realize that we're coming up on 10 minutes to the top of the hour, and some of you may not have allotted additional time. So I think I'm kicking it back to Sasha.
I think that Sasha and Nicole are going to be responsible for managing, particularly Nicole, I think is going to be responsible for managing the Q&A section. So we'll turn it over to her. Thank you, Gordon. Excellent presentation. I think everyone learned a lot there.
Do you want me to take the slides off screen or leave them up for a while?
I believe I just took them off. I think it'll be good for us to reiterate who the speakers are as it comes up. So thank you.
Thanks.
So thanks, Gordon, and thank you for mentioning again that folks should feel free to write into the Q&A box. I know we've had a couple of questions about materials, and some of the answers that we don't get to today, we'll be providing those materials after the webinar to attendees, and we'll also be providing answers to some of the questions that we've responded to here, and some of the questions that we won't have time for today. But let's get started with some of the questions we've gotten so far. We had a couple of questions about what types of communities this program is a really good fit for. So Josephine McNeil asked what are characteristics of communities that could benefit from this technical assistance? And Marlene DeLeon asked what this looks like in a fairly homogeneous community. And maybe Mark, you could speak to those communities first, and then Gordon could speak to what this has looked like in GARE's work so far.
Great. Thanks for the question, Josephine. I feel there's not a single community in the MAPC region that could not benefit from this work. We have intentionally tried to develop this program in such a way that it could be available to larger communities and smaller communities, cities and towns, communities with substantially diverse populations, or communities that are very limited in terms of diversity. We think that racism and racial inequity exists everywhere because it exists throughout the region, and we all have a responsibility and a role to play in trying to reverse it. So I think that every community could benefit from this, and I only wish we were choosing more than 3 to 5. But we are certainly going to choose a mix. So the communities that are chosen will not be completely similar to one another. The very idea is that they should be different and should share with one another and learn from one another despite their differences, or perhaps even because of their differences. I'll turn it over to Gordon.
And was there a particular question or the same question? I'm sorry.
Well, there is the question of from Marlene in Foxborough about how this might look in a relatively homogeneous community.
Yeah, so thank you very much for asking that one, Marlene, because I think your question about more focused on a goal than on the sends. You know, there are a couple of things I don't know about your particular environment, but I think one of the questions then comes down to, you know, what's the history of Foxborough? What's its relationship to the rest of the metro? Are there some housing patterns with Foxborough that were established out of, let's say, FHA, and maybe some continuing patterns around housing that largely keep Foxborough homogeneous? You know, what's the nature of homogeneity there? Is there something that is happening regionally that has created that situation? And if you begin digging into your history and you find out that that is the case, are there some things currently that are contributing to keeping it the way that it is? So there's something about context that we have to have, I think, a little bit more of a conversation informed with some data there. I think your other question about being more focused on a goal, attracting via housing and lending plans. It's been my experience that there are many communities that have, you know, I just have to look down the street here to Minneapolis to see that they just changed their planning from being significantly single family only, right? In large parts of South Minneapolis. And how that came to be, because that was actually a direct response to a period of time where there had been Black families living there. And then due to some redevelopment, I think with the lakes in Minneapolis, a decision was made to not have any other type of housing there but single family. If you have sort of a mono planning and use plan that is not accommodating different income levels, different family styles, that may be one of the places to look. If you don't have access to public transportation, there may be some historic reasons why that is the case. So I think going a little bit further into taking a look at why things are the way they are may lead to some answers about where there's an opportunity for broader connection. So that's, without knowing more about Foxborough, I would encourage you to apply because I suspect that there is some work to do and that asking the question, maybe why we are so homogenous might begin to get us to a better understanding about some of the factors that are contributing to that, particularly maybe keeping it that way.
Thank you, Gordon, and thank you, Mark. Gordon, I have another question for you. I know a couple of folks have asked about what resources there are available to municipalities outside of MEPC's region or outside of this program. I'm wondering if you could speak to opportunities for other Massachusetts municipalities. I think we specifically had questions about Western Massachusetts.
I saw a question about whether or not we had any members in Western Mass. I am not aware that we do have any members in Western Massachusetts. We have worked all over the country and certainly, would welcome doing work there. The other part of the question though, please.
Yes, so outside of just Western Massachusetts, for municipalities that aren't outside of MEPC's region or aren't participating in this program, what types of resources are there for municipalities to work with GARE or to work on racial equity?
Right. So, GARE, if you contact us, we now have a process for triaging requests. As you might well imagine, we're inundated with requests right now to work with jurisdictions. And one of the ways that we are finding is more helpful for touching a number of jurisdictions is through this type of a process, where we have multiple jurisdictions coming together to work with a core partner who helps them assemble a cohort. So that is one of the things that we highly recommend. We as an organization, as a program, will also be launching some GARE Foundations webinars that'll be taking place starting up in October. And those will have some foundational trainings for building a jurisdiction's capacity to take on this work. Aside from that, we have a number of guides that are located on our website. I'll be glad to share a link to the resources on our website and to other webinars that we have done for COVID-19, for instance. We had a COVID-19 rapid response effort that was open not only to our membership, but open to all jurisdictions nationally, and provided some really good insights on some of the things that jurisdictions are doing with racial equity analysis to guide their work. So glad to provide those through MAPC to you.
Thank you. Next, we have some logistical questions. So this is a question for Mark. A few folks asked whether communities can submit a joint application between communities. And then there were a few other questions clarifying how municipalities will work together during this process and what's valued in that cooperation. So Mark, could you speak to that first point of whether communities could submit a joint application? And then Gordon, could you speak to where that value lies in that cooperation between municipalities?
So as Steve knows, who asked the question, we often encourage municipalities to apply together. for projects that has not been envisioned thus far in this process. But I think what we will do is we will go back to the team afterwards and see if we make a decision about whether or not we want to encourage or accept joint applications from neighboring communities, or whether in this case we want to stick with each individual municipality. We promise to get back to everyone on that. We'll send out our answers to the whole group that registered. I think Nicole asked Gordon to explain a little bit about how the participating communities will actually share their work.
Yes.
In addition to doing work on their own.
Okay, so that will be structured. We use a consultancy model with jurisdictions. So it'll happen across jurisdictions. It'll be a facilitated process that GARE will manage. And it will happen at regular intervals around stages of the work that we're going through. And so it'll probably start even at our second session as the jurisdictions are coming back with some of the work that they've done between sessions. To first of all, begin to break down the level of just sort of feeling like everything has to be perfect, because we're not dealing in the world of perfection here for doing this work. And also to get people used to developing a level of candor and trust with the colleagues who are doing this work. It is our fondest hope that what you are participating in is the beginning of creating a community of change focused on government and racial equity, and that those who are participating in this will become resources for the communities that come after you. So we'll spend a fair amount of time in short bursts, just getting people used to that, because we know that it is counter to most jurisdictions' experience to just share some of the things that might not be working quite as well or aren't quite perfect yet. But that is absolutely essential for us all making progress.
Thank you. And then, Gordon, I have a question for you around success. Mayor Spicer asked for you, where are a few successful communities that you've worked with to move the needle? And we've also asked for a couple of examples of racial equity actions that have been included in previous plans. So a better idea of what success looks like in this process.
Success is actually having data that you can use to help you understand where there are differences in experience, differences in outcomes, results that your population is experiencing, and how your actions may be contributing to that. Not knowing always gives you sort of, you don't know, you don't have to take action. Once you start actually showing where there are those significant differences, I think we're compelled to act at that point. Success looks like having a dashboard and a data portal that is informed by the people who are most significantly disadvantaged in our communities, communities of color, immigrant communities, which reflects some of the measures that we and they are tracking to better understand that their lives are better off. And you don't see that in very many jurisdictions in the country. The Race and Social Justice Initiative, which came out of Seattle, was in many ways one of the forebears of that, and some of the work in Portland, Oregon. I think when you start seeing public-facing commitments followed up with actually having the Racial Equity Action Plan also public-facing, that creates a situation where the public understands this is what you're working on, you've committed resources and time to it, and you are actually asking the public and your staff to be accountable to achieving some of those outcomes. Minneapolis Park and Rec Board has their Racial Equity Action Plan on their website. City of Portland, I believe, has the same. I'm not sure about this. I think either Austin or San Antonio does. And there are several other jurisdictions which are moving that practice forward. It's more a practice of here's what our Racial Equity Action Plan is, and here's how that's impacting our budget. Here's how it's impacting how we work with the public to make decisions about capital improvements. I'd also say Hennepin County Library System. There are several others that are doing this. City of Denver, I think you're going to be seeing launch some efforts pretty soon in this area. But I mean, be glad to have this conversation longer. But there is no community that has done it, right? Completed it in terms of achieving racial equity. But they have started moving the dial towards achieving more racially equitable outcomes in their programs and in their services. And so I hope that answer gives you some insights as to what some of the factors are that contribute to success.
Thank you. There are a few more logistical questions. So a quick one for you, Gordon, is whether GARE members are eligible for this program.
GARE members and non-members are eligible for this program. There is no points assigned for being a GARE member. So I hope that answers that question.
Yes.
Let's say just one more thing about my previous answer. I don't know how many of you are aware that the city of Asheville, also a GARE member, recently made news by actually having their city council acknowledge, number one, the history of the city of Asheville and contributing to racial inequities, the impact that it had in particular on their Black citizens, and then how they were actually thinking about changing some of their allocations in housing and changing some of their priorities to address those challenges that they were directly related to creating. I believe also City of Evanston has done that. I mentioned those because that process of acknowledgement, which is part of atonement, right? And then following through with policy, that's a significant change. So to the mayor's question, you know, what are some of the examples? These are some early stage examples of reparations, quite frankly. And that conversation, reparations is largely not necessarily about the economic aspect, but the acknowledgement of the contribution historically to racial inequity and the role of government in that. And then saying, here's what we think we need to do differently. I believe there was also an apology as well from Asheville. So we're proud to say that that is really pushing the field to a new level of recognition, and local government has been key in doing that. They were not waiting for the federal government for that, or the state. And this is North Carolina.
Let's move along because we are, we're at 10:05. I just want to acknowledge that. So Nicole, do you have other questions? I see some coming in the Q&A.
Yes, so I have a set of questions for you, Mark, about resources for MEPC communities. So we've heard a couple questions about, since there only about 5 communities will be selected, what are resources available to MEPC municipalities that aren't selected through this process? And then a related question is about what benefits there will be to municipalities that aren't selected from this program. So what resources might be available or deliverables coming out of this program that municipalities could use?
Yep. Well, first of all, I would ask everyone not to be discouraged. We recognize this is a region-wide issue. In fact, it's much more than a region-wide issue. We wish we could serve more than 3 to 5 municipalities right now. We are still trying to fundraise to see if we can provide direct grant resources to the participants. We have not been able to do that yet, but we're still working on it. We at least have been able to cover through MAPC's resources and through the Fed's resources all the technical assistance, training, and planning that are part of these programs. There won't be any fee to the participating municipalities. In terms of, and we'll keep you advised as to whether or not we obtain more resources that can go to the municipal participants. As far as the remaining communities are involved or are concerned, there's always the possibility to apply for technical assistance in this arena, either through the district local technical assistance program or the Planning for Metro Future technical assistance program, DLTA and PMTA. As communities know, we generally take applications for technical assistance twice a year, and it's also open on a rolling basis as well. People can come to us at any time. I know there may be communities that wish to approach and address the issue of racial equity on their own in a particular way that may not be part of this larger program, but is still related to issues of racial equity, and they can certainly apply through DLTA or PMTA in that regard.
Mark, if I can just add to, from the Boston Fed perspective, well, one thing, as a work group, we've talked about some of the resources. First of all, those are a lot of resources, so probably what we can do is put those together so folks have that, including GARE's resources listed together. We also, as a work group, had started to talk about it. There are ways to make some of the materials available from this process, so we'll continue to talk about that and let registrants know about that. Also, from our perspective, we do serve all of New England, so we've considered this a pilot, and if this is successful, it works, we feel like there's some benefit, real benefit, and some, we're able to demonstrate that. We'd like to be able to see that expand to other places. That will take time. I should emphasize we're not a grant funder, so we're actually not able to do grants and sort of ourselves expand this. So it really would be something that we'd have to look for partners to be able to do in other places as well. But that's definitely something that we have in mind.
I'll add a few things very quickly. Desiree and I have already sent out this information to 3 funders just this week. So we are pursuing that. Whether it's successful or not, we have no way to know, but we are certainly trying very hard. I am going to send our NGO and application form to all of my colleagues at the other regional planning agencies in Massachusetts, just in case they are interested in trying to set up similar programs. I don't expect all of them will, but there are 12 of them. I'm sure that a few of them might. And I would also note that as people in the MAPC region, even if you are not selected to work on this program, as you file applications for technical assistance in any one of a number of other ways, whether it be, like a housing production plan, which we're doing right now with the town of Foxborough, which, was mentioned a little earlier here, whether you're doing it, an economic development plan or a small business assistance plan, like we're doing with the city of Revere, it is always possible to incorporate issues of racial equity into those projects. In fact, we prioritize the projects that fund issues of racial equity when they come to us for technical assistance. So the full-blown training and planning program for racial equity across all the sectors in your community may be most desirable, but it is not the only way to approach racial equity, and people should not wait to approach racial equity just until they kind of have that gold standard. There are many ways to do it through individual, smaller, more topically limited subjects, and we are glad to be a partner in those as well.
I have another question for you, Mark. We've had quite a few questions about the makeup of that core team. Could you speak to the balance between municipal staff and inviting partners and volunteers into that group, and what is most effective?
We feel the majority of members of that team, which can be up to 12 people, should be municipal elected officials, appointed officials, or staff. So it could be the mayor or manager. It could be department heads. It could be line staff. It could be the member of an appointed or an elected board. Those are all parts of municipal government. And we do think that should constitute the majority of the members or all of the members. It is certainly possible to invite other key community leaders to be part of that core team. We would suggest that that not be most of the members, but it can be some of the members. And I would suggest that you try and choose people who already have an understanding of the operations of municipal government, maybe are already working with the municipality in some way, shape, or form, so that everybody working together will be able to kind of hit the ground running with the program, both the training part and then eventually the planning part. We understand there are many power centers in a city or town, not just the municipality, and bringing them on board would be useful. Let me also note that, or at least it's an option that people have. Let me also note, as you see in the application form, there's also a place to indicate partners. Those are not necessarily members of the core team, but they are partners who you will be engaging in the planning and eventually in the implementation work. That's another way to bring in other people from outside of municipal government. And when we get to the planning part in phase 2, Gordon can speak more to this, a lot of that planning is an open planning process, not restricted to the core team or even the core team and the partners. We're looking for community engagement. So there are many ways and many levels for people from throughout the city or town to be involved, even if they're not on the core team.
Yeah, Mark, I just to double down on that, the reason that we have community engagement and community participation is so that we can have accountability to the community for results, ways that people's lives are better off. And if we only leave the analysis of the data to those of us working in government, we're likely to lead with some of the same assumptions and not benefit from some of the insights about why the data looks the way it does and why some of our processes and procedures that we think may be very helpful might not actually even be apparent or accessible to people who really need them. So that's going to be a key piece of this. And I think that for any entity that has done the experiment of inventing something, putting it out there, and having to roll it back and reinvent it and recalibrate and recalibrate and recalibrate, we will, I'm not going to say that there's not going to be any of that that's happening, but it certainly is going to be interrupted by having more awareness, more participation, and more design influence by the people who are supposed to benefit from all of our processes. So thanks for bringing that up.
Gordon, I have a question for you around how to center communities of color in this work, and also about how to make sure that this plan and this planning process is really transparent and open to community members throughout that process.
So awareness happens when we are broadly communicating what we're doing and going beyond some of the traditional channels that we use. So I do think that the partnership piece is going to be key here. And in some cases, you might not have all of the partners that you need. You may need to actually start working through other relationships to start building, first of all, a level of awareness and then some trust. So that, and maybe even having other associations and groups begin to carry part of the agenda of this work to those who are a part of a racial or ethnic part of our community that we're really trying to reach, right? And so I think that's really important to realize that just because we have had a history of doing outreach doesn't mean that that has been effective, and it doesn't mean that we've had a long history in government of telling people what we did with their input, you know, and even sort of honoring what that has been. So having this in the Racial Equity Toolkit process, having a focus first on how are people supposed to benefit, not what is this program supposed to operate from, let's say, the standpoint of where we're getting the money, but how people benefit. Data collection that is then shared with the community. Don't be having conversations about, the community's challenges without involving them in that. We come to our own conclusions, a lot of it informed by whether or not people are trying hard enough versus whether or not they actually have access to what they need to succeed. That leads a lot of our analysis and sort of leads us to our own conclusions. So it may be the case that some of our more vocal critics are also a part of this process of informing us about how we analyze our data and what's missing from that analysis. And some of that is the perceptions of our work, right? It's just not informed by people's real perceptions about whether or not a process is even accessible. So that's going to be a laddered process going all the way through on the Racial Equity Toolkit side. It has a parallel to that on the Racial Equity Action Plan side. A plan that just appears without any input or accountability to how all of our community is doing, and in particular, the focus on those who are most significantly disadvantaged in our communities. And in many cases where we're seeing that happen is with communities of color and immigrant communities. And there's overlap with low-income white communities too. But from a proportionate share perspective, significantly more people of color than you would expect to see, right? In some of the misery index in our communities, that is actually going to be carrying the day for these racial equity action plans. And it's one of the reasons that the plans take some time to pull together, is that, if you just want to move really fast, get a couple of staff people into it in a day. If you want it to actually have an impact, you're going to have to take some time to accommodate having people in the community participate in this. And that means that it's not going to happen on our schedule necessarily. It may have to be a parallel process, but it does have to require us to change what we're doing in order to get that insight and that information. And then to be willing to set up some of the communication structures and the transparency to make it a living document that has some public facing awareness and some tracking, quite frankly. So you know what this means? This means we're taking some measured risks, right? I mean, I hope you all realize, if this is not business as usual, that there are some risks that you're going to be taking. And that means that there may be some risk and there can be some really great reward. But how we begin to frame up this work so that we can be successful, acknowledging that the risk is there, but doing everything that we can to ensure that we are including people is going to be key to managing that risk.
Arden, I know you just spoke to a piece of this, but we have a question from Mayor Driscoll on how to best manage this need or desire to act right now on racial equity, and also that need to go slowly, collect info and data, and really respect that this is long overdue work. So how do we balance those two things that are in tension with one another?
It's good that there's urgency now. It's good because, quite frankly, I worry when people call this a moment. American culture is a move-on culture, and we move and lurch from one moment to the next without actually digging in to the root causes of why we're experiencing racial inequities in the first place. Moving quickly may satisfy our individual sense of, well, we did something. Doing something may not be doing the right thing. If you really want to begin to address the challenges that all of us are facing, this is not just, significant impact is on communities of color. But I really appreciated the comments from the Fed representative earlier. Our economy, our society, our civic institutions are all suffering because we are still trying to live up to those aspirational values that government is supposed to be about. And until we begin to realize that this is not going to be a quick fix, it's not going to be a simple piece, there's not going to be any one single thing that you can do that's going to make things okay, right? It's only by taking the time to slow and change the culture of the work that we're doing within government and how we begin to apply tools to rectify some of the challenges that are being created by some of our one-size-fits-all solutions, quite frankly, that we're going to be able to make a difference. And I want you to know something. Doing something quickly is not exactly the thing that's trusted, okay? So I just want you to know that, because when people say things like knee-jerk reactions, be prepared to hear that, because for communities of color, immigrant communities that have been wondering when you would notice, you know, the George Floyd incident was not, it was a shock to everyone, but it wasn't a surprise to everybody. And there are so many other things that begins to sum it up in terms of how people have been existing and feeling. And when you hear people say, oh, now you see, is this what it took for you to see? Sort of the instant reaction is almost always going to be not the right thing. And it's not going to be getting to the longer term issues. I would welcome anybody, I welcome you to have conversations with people, people of color and immigrant communities about this, just to get their insights about it. But this has been our experience. It certainly has been mine.
Thank you so much, Gordon. I know that we're getting close to time, so I have one more, and we do have a lot of questions that we may not be able to answer to the best of our ability today, but we do have them, and we'll be trying to answer those afterwards as well. So one more logistical question. So we've heard from a couple of folks on whether this work should be focused in one area, so like housing or transportation or small businesses, or educational and job training opportunities, or if this is a more holistic approach. And so I think both Gordon, you and Mark could speak to this each briefly.
Well, I'll just say very quickly, this is not a program for like just transportation or just housing. It is a holistic program. It does require the community to come to terms with and to grapple with some of the systemic issues that it is facing. That said, it doesn't have to cover everything. It doesn't have to be every single issue in the community. So it can't be just one. It doesn't have to be everything. It needs to be something in between. If you are interested in focusing on racial equity specifically as it relates to a specific topical area, that's probably another technical assistance application to MAPC or to another provider. But we also realize that people will want to try and focus, and that goes into a quality application. Gordon, I don't know if you have anything to add on that from your experience.
So I saw, of course, the only other thing I'll add is that in terms of the intentionality of selecting your team for this, I saw a comment earlier about voluntold or volunteering.
Yes.
And I just want to say, I think people need to understand that this, when you're asking them to join the team, this is not the annual sort of compliance-based training piece, okay? And I want to say that because people are used to the government doing that, and they'll say, oh, it's a project, it's a special initiative, okay? This is about making a long-term commitments. to organizational culture change. So I want you to think about some of those team members in terms of their awareness of that. Because when people show up and say things like, well, I was just told to be here, how long is this going to take, right? That's when we know that we've got some problems. And that problem is going to be one of the issues you'll be dealing with as they begin to understand more about the work, may actually become very interested in it, but just realize that they can't really commit to the time that's needed to move it forward. So I hope that's helpful in that regard. I wanted to just speak to that particular fine point about this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark and Gordon, for answering these questions, and thank you to everyone for asking such wonderful questions. I want to make sure that I pass this off to Raul to give us some next steps and closing thoughts.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you so much, everyone, for these very, very great questions that we will, if we did not have the time to discuss today, we'll be more than happy to provide information afterwards. So I really just wanted to spend the last couple minutes to talk about some of the key next steps. And really it's more to reiterate some of the things that I've sent via email to the registration as well as the REMAP website. This recording, along with all relevant resources, will be posted on the MAPC REMAP webpage, which can be found in the registration email that was sent to all of you. We'll also send the link in a follow-up email. The deadline for submissions, as Mark said, is close of business on August 20th. MAPC will acknowledge receipt of the proposed project concepts within 2 business days. Also, given the great amount of interest in the process, we saw that there were quite a few people that registered today. The September 3rd selection date has been changed and pushed to September 10th. Please submit a completed application form as well as a short 2 to 3 page project concept on municipal letterhead to myself, Raul Gonzalez, at rgonzalez@mapc.org with the subject heading of Racial Equity Municipal Action Plan, followed by the name of your municipality. All of this information is located within the NGO, so I'll be sure to follow up with that email. If you have any additional questions or would like to check in on the status of your submittal, please contact me at the number or email located on the screen. And again, I will follow up with that information. And lastly, I just wanted to take this time to thank you for engaging interest in this project and for taking the time to participate in our webinar. We find REMAP to be a very unique opportunity to receive tailored training from a nationally recognized organization and to work with other municipalities in the region to address shared challenges and to learn together. We look forward to seeing your applications and furthermore in seeing our communities take advantage and take meaningful action in furthering racial equity through this program. Thank you so much for your submission and for participating. And we look forward to your submissions. And we'd like for you to have a great rest of your week. So thank you so much, everybody. Goodbye.